Hi, my name is Joanne Palmieri. I'm the acting curator of the John and Mary Nichols Rare Books and Special Collections at the University of Oklahoma. This is a wonderful collection that was named in honor of John and Mary Nichols on behalf of their longtime service to the university and to the libraries. And with their generous support, we were able to establish this fourth of several special collections on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. And what I've done is I've brought out some books to give you a feel for the collection, which is coming up to about 13,000 books. The collection itself highlights and has important works in British, American, European literature from the 15th century to the present. And what I've shown you here are some of the most beloved authors of the English language, Britain and English and American authors. One of the core parts of the collection is the Dickens collection, which is really remarkable. We have first editions of Dickens' print works, but also the serialized installments of his works. Now, for many of these authors that you'll see today, like Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, and other authors that I will show, most of us have seen those in paperback editions, but it's really remarkable to see how a contemporary reader would have experienced reading A Tale of Two Cities for the first time, for example, in these weekly installments. Or even from 1843, A Christmas Carol. This is one of my favorites, with these wonderful illustrations of the Fuzzywigs. And these are some of the other editions of Dickens that we have that came out in these installments. And one reason for doing this is that they were cheaper for the buying public, and also it kind of whetted the appetite of the reader to see what will happen next with the characters. And Dickens was a master at creating these wonderful characters, which you'll see some depictions of here in a collection that we have from Joseph Clark, also known as Kidd, who had these wonderful watercolors in the late 19th century of some of Dickens' characters. There we have Fagin and also Mr. Bumble from The Poorhouse. And this is a copy of Oliver Twist. It's one of Dickens' works that actually came out in book form first before the installments. You see a wonderful image of Oliver's reception by Fagin and the boys. And again, many of these books, we experience them even within media first or film, and it's really rich to be able to see them as a contemporary reader did. Now there's a gee whiz, wonderful, exciting, emotional aspect to seeing the book, but there's also a scholarly reason. It tells us something about how the publishing business worked, how authors worked, and also how people read books. And these are the kind of things that people on this campus, for instance, are maybe interested in doing research on the history of the book, on English literature. And so we are happy to open this collection to scholars, to students. And in fact, on this campus, we really want to promote the use of collections for undergrads and graduate students. Another one of my favorites, which again, many of you may have encountered in a paperback Penguin classic, but here is Pride and Prejudice. And it's in this small 3-volume set with what probably one of the most famous lines there is in literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. And we have all the first editions of Jane Austen, one of my particular favorite authors. So in addition to some of these classic authors, we have a few more that I'll show you here. Arthur Conan Doyle, many of the Sherlock Holmes editions. And this particular edition is one in which he uses the idea of a fingerprint to solve a crime for the first time, and it's 1905, and also a copy of H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. So moving over here, the collection is also represented by American literature and authors. Mark Twain, we have a very interesting collection of works by Mark Twain. Here's Tom Sawyer, first edition. Herman Melville's The Whale, which is actually the 5 millionth volume from the University of Oklahoma, added to the library. And a collection of Louisa May Alcott's works, Little Women. And one thing I want to point out is a special collection. It's wonderful to look and see these original first editions, but special collections are special because they also have unique materials. So something that would only exist in that particular book. And not everything is on the internet, and so sometimes a book will have something very unique that would be helpful in research for a topic or a person, or it just tells you something about the origin of the book. For instance, we have this book by the poet Robert Frost that actually has a handwritten copy of one of his poems on the book. It's a presentation copy. So most of the books in our collection most of the materials in this collection, I should say, are printed, but we do have materials like this, and we also have manuscript materials, sometimes leaves that are inserted in books that might tell us something about the books. So I've talked a little about the literary classics that we have, but the collection is also strong in general in rare books, and rare books dating from the 15th century. And that could be something like the dramatists, famous dramatist William Shakespeare. This is the second folio from 1632. It's a really beautiful copy. And it's part of a collection that we have of stagecraft, books on the plays, on the history of the stage that is really valuable to scholars who are doing history of the stage and from the 1600s. And over here I have a few examples of some of the different plays that we have. These are actually all on a theme of love. We had a Valentine's exhibit which kind of highlighted some of these a few months back. So these date from 1694, from 1728, and from 1735 by Dryden, Fielding, and some others. So this is something that people who are doing research in that area can look at. And again, a special collection is important because it may have unique materials. This is something I've discovered on the shelf recently that is basically someone had put together or collected from the early 1800s some productions, playbills from Covent Garden. So this may be something also that someone interested in looking into the history of theater would like to use or utilize. So in addition to the history of the stage, we have works that can be considered political theory, essays, travel books, law, and political tracts, religious tracts, and we're also very strong in biblical materials. This one I wanted to take out, again, because it's something that is very recognizable. You may be familiar with Gulliver's Travels, maybe as a children's story, as a film, but here is the original edition from Jonathan Swift from 1726, which is really not a children's story, and it has a lot to say. It's a satire on the culture of the period, and so it's relevant in a lot of areas. In fact, if you look at the table of contents here, he's critiquing some of the academies at the time. So there's some interesting connections with the history of science and with literary life of the time that he is interested in critiquing. Again, in the collection we have not only poets, say Milton, Spencer, and dramatists and literary works, but we have political theorists, works on history, collected works of, say, like King James, things like that. And here is a well-known political treatise, Leviathan, by Thomas Hobbes. It really has a beautiful, well-known picture over here, and 1651 is when it was published, often repeated. And again, some of you may have counted this in a paperback edition. In addition to this kind of book, which is a kind of a treatise, we have a lot of pamphlets which are religious, political, where authors are dealing with contemporary issues. And one thing I brought out too that the topic is the idea of having a standing army, and is that consistent with the principles of a free government? And so the first pamphlet is the initial publication in 1697, and the second one you'll see by Daniel Defoe is a reply to that. And I brought these out to emphasize the idea of thinking about a special collection and the works in it as a kind of conversation. So people, authors and individuals at a particular time are talking to each other, but there's also continuing a conversation about ideas, values that really comes up to the present. And that's one reason that we're still compelled to look at these works. Moving on, I have some of the last works that I want to show that are some of the older materials we have. And two of these are printed in the 1400s, which is right after the beginning of printing. And because of that, they look very much like a manuscript, which I actually have a copy of here of a 13th century Bible, a leaf from a Bible. And so when printing as a technology began in the mid-1400s, it mimicked the tradition that they knew, the manuscript tradition. And thinking about that transition is actually very important for today. You know, special collections are important because they highlight the value of books and the history books have played in our culture, but also because they help us think about the transition that we're going through now in our digital age. And I find it very valuable to bring classes and to talk to students about thinking about the perspective of these books and understanding how we went from manuscript to print, and then in the 19th century, the mass publication of books, what kind of changes that impacted on our culture and different cultures, and then think about how those things are relevant today in our digital world, and thinking about how we write, how we talk to each other, and how that influences the way we think. And so I think special collections are important in that way. And so in the beginning of printing, this is a book, this is the earliest book from 1483, and you can see it does also resemble a medieval text. It's actually, like many printed books in the 1400s and 1500s, a printed edition of an earlier work that is from 12th century, and it's a book on canon law, an important book on canon law. The last book is an important book in the history of printing. It's by a well-known publisher, Koberger, and it's basically a biblical and world history. So kind of the history of the world is seen through the scripture depicted, but also histories of cities, history of culture. And this book, published in 1493, is also quite significant because the degree to which illustrations are incorporated into the text. And in fact, very much like printed books at this time, sometimes the illustrations are actually repeated. But this is in Nuremberg, and actually this is the city where the book was published. So this is a really fine example of a book, again, from 1493, that can be used for research in a number of areas, for like many aspects of our collection, for religion, politics, history, and that's the mission of this particular collection, to be able to promote use of these books for research, teaching, all levels, for scholars, for graduate students and undergraduates, and we would like to see that continue.